Sandra Meigs was born in Baltimore in 1953. Meigs studied at the Rhode Island School of Design, the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, where she got her BFA in 1975, and the Dalhousie University, where she got her MA in 1980. She has lived and worked in Canada since 1973. Sandra Meigs has been a dedicated teacher at the University of Victoria for over 20 years, and recently, how many years ago, moved back to Ontario? 5 years ago, moved and lives in Hamilton. And she's mentored hundreds of visual arts students through her professorship, and that is something I can really attest to. Sandra's impact as a teacher is profound, and as you'll see when you experience this show, and if you delve into her work more generally, and you'll find a lot of what you need to learn more about Sandra on her website, which is really very comprehensive and helpful, that she has this, you could say eccentric, I guess, this very distinctive and individual way of looking at the world and experiencing the world. And for me, Sandra, her career kind of really epitomizes that quality of going your own way and pursuing your own experience of the world, not swayed by what the rest of the art world is doing or what's happening. As it turns out, she's ended up ahead of the curve of everyone else by taking her own meandering and exquisitely interesting path. But it's always been, really, I think the thing at the core of your whole project has been this incredible loyalty to yourself and deep authenticity, which is not something you find every day. So, remarkable artist. Jessica Bradley, another one who has gone her own way in this world and created enormous productivity and change and opportunity for a lot of artists over the years, is an independent curator based in Toronto formerly and now in Montreal. She's been the curator of contemporary art at the Archive of Ontario, 1995 to 2004. So many of the marvelous projects that you saw at the AGO over the years were under Jessica's dainty hand and her brilliant mind. She was also associate curator of contemporary art at the National Gallery of Canada from 1980 to 1987. So these are big building block chunks of time in these institutions when Jessica was building collections and building program and always, at least 5 to 8 years ahead of the curve of other people, noticing that an artist, I'm thinking, for example, of William Kentridge, many other fantastic international artists had very early shows under Jessica's guidance. Bradley has published extensively and organized numerous solo and group exhibitions in Canada and abroad. I think she's done how many Venice Biennales for Canada? 3? Which is unheard of.
You have to stick around long enough.
Yeah, you don't give up. It's amazing where you end up, She founded her own commercial gallery in Toronto, which ran from 2005 to 15. So that's another huge block of time where she mounted more than 80 exhibitions featuring a rising generation of artists who are all deeply indebted to her insights, I have no doubt. Bradley was guest curator of 2 recent exhibitions at the McMichael since I've been here. Marie-Claire Blais Veils, which was one of the first shows we did in our new contemporary series when I came here, and brilliant artists from Montreal, and Margot Williamson Interiors, which was last year, which were those spectacular large format paintings of interiors that you all will have enjoyed as we came out of the pandemic. They were just, it seemed like just the most prescient and brilliant show in the world. It went on to the Esker Foundation in Calgary, but that was also Jessica's very good work. So we just have the privilege of their company today, and we're a nice and intimate and committed, anyone who showed up here today in the rainstorm in the middle of a long weekend gets a gold star. So this is a very special group of people. So I don't know, Jessica, before we start, I want to actually thank very much the people who helped to bring resources together for this show. The exhibition and the book, which will be coming out shortly, we just had the installation photographed yesterday. The book is dedicated to a woman that we all love very much in the Toronto art world, and that's Jean Parkin, who is now in her 101st year and still is as informed as most people I know in the Canadian art world about what's what and what's new. For many years, she ran the art acquisition program at McCarthy Tetro and had many other clients as well. I mean, she was actively working well into her late 90s. She is a force of nature. She's not well enough to be with us today. But here's the list of people who gathered round to empower us to make a book for this exhibition in honor of Jeannie. Richard Balfour, Terry Burgoyne, Yvonne and David Fleck, Jennifer Parkin and David George, Jennifer being her daughter, bless her, Risa Greenberg in Ottawa, Bill and Sue Kidd, Margaret McNee, Phil Lind and Ellen Rowland, Gerald Sheff and Shanitha Katchen, and the Jack Weinbaum Family Foundation. So my really sincere thanks to them all. I know, Sandra, that you're one of Jeannie's absolutely favorite artists in Canada. She just adores your work. I saw her the other day and told her about this. Went to visit her at the Yorkville or the Hazelton, and she was just delighted to hear about this. I also noticed Jeannie's favorite color is a kind of a hot scarlet red. And so I noticed that there's a lot of that beautiful color in this show, and so we're going to be taking a box of the books when we get them down to her at the Hazelton to share that with her, and maybe even we'll get her up here to see it. But her daughter's not so sure. But anyway, Jeannie is in the room, and all the people that love Jeannie that helped this and love you, Sandra, that helped this to happen. So Jessica, I don't know if you want to kick off with some questions about how this show came to be. I mean, I remember when you brought this to my attention, but why don't you tell that story, because it was a great...
Oh, well, I could start with a little curatorial disclosure, which Sandra is quite aware of, and that was, it's probably almost 2 years ago, and I was idly scrolling through my Instagram feed, and there was this tiny screen with a picture of Sandra sitting on the edge of the woods with a painting kit. And I was stunned. I thought, Sandra Meigs, plein air painter? I mean, I knew that she had, that landscape had been in her work, and that she had come up with these incredibly fantastic narratives, these tragicomedies that, come at, that are experiential, but then that she can put out in the world in a form of stories or fables. I knew that about her work. And I'd known her work for a long time, so I felt a little bit taken aback. And so when I was thinking about that image, it kept being eclipsed by another image, and you can imagine which one, and that was the iconic one of Tom Thompson up there on the bluff with his with the landscape in front of him and with his kit doing his thing. And this rolled around in my mind for a few days, and then Sandra posted a couple more, actually, these gouaches, and that was kind of it. And I remember saying to you, I think I sent one, I said, look what Sandra Meigs is doing. And Sarah, in her inimitable way, she says, oh, we have to do something with that. And then we have to get right on it. It rolls out that Tom Thompson is coming up, and so there was this kind of frenzied conversations between us. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that I went out, contacted Sandra and said, I really need to see this work. I'm fascinated. Yeah. I'm kind of stunned. So off I went to Hamilton a few weeks later. And we began to look at these wonderful gouaches that had this incredible, this spontaneity. They were so vivid, the colors, the movement in them, like sort of drifting, you'll see in there, from almost abstraction to, fairly direct depictions of trees. It certainly wasn't the grand landscape
splayed out
of Canadian art history.
Not heroic.
There it is, nothing heroic, but very attentive, and as bright and vivacious as these gouache paintings were, they were also really intimate. So that's what got it going. But what I'd like to talk about is, in those visits, what I discovered was, of course, that Sandra, for I dare say 40 years, has been going out into nature and painting in nature, not big paintings, but these wonderful, quick works. And in many places, not just in the woods, but in deserts in the far north, amongst the incredible old growth of the Pacific Northwest, in the prairies. I don't need to,
She's done it all.
talk about them. I need you to tell us more about what's that's meant for you in your work. Since this is really the first time we're seeing some of that kind of work.
Wow. It's true. I think my first foray into that was a trip to Arkansas, of all places. So I bought a fishing tackle box and I jammed it full of as much gouache as I could and brushes, and I always get the large sheets of paper, divide them into 4. So I just have a thing that makes me feel secure in the landscape. I have a self-made portfolio. You have to take a big jug of water so you don't get sunstroke, and you can mix your paints. And I followed up that trip with trips to the deserts, as Jessica said, the forests, and sometimes would get invited to do residencies. For example, in Clayoquot Sound, I did you could call it a residency with like about 10 other artists. And it has always been my haven, I think. And it's time I spend alone by myself, with no goals or anything like that. So it just becomes, for me, a very important form of meditation, grounding, and connection to the earth. Now, often through that process, I would envision a series of paintings. And when I was in Clayoquot Sound, I went to what is known as Cougar Annie's Garden, which is now a foundation called Boat Basin. And I envisioned the geography of the landscape as a pathway to awakening. And I developed a little narrative about a young girl who encounters magical things in the forest and eats her first cherry that's like awakening her. And she goes up to Ray Lake, and then she becomes transported into the skies. And so that's an example of the way I work with the gouache. Yeah. And I like gouache because it's an uncomplicated medium. It doesn't really require skill. It just feels very direct to me. I don't really think about what I'm doing. I just do it.
Yeah, maybe we could just shift into the last 3 years. I probably when I first visited you, we were wearing masks. I mean, one gets this very distorted sense of time, but some of those trips, at least to Calabogie and Algonquin, were during the pandemic, which was perhaps a different need at that point. I don't know if you want to.
How did you get the idea to go up there? And did you know when you went up there that you were going to be making work that related to climate change?
I moved back to Ontario. I lived in Toronto for 10 years, but we didn't have a car and we didn't get up to Algonquin. Basically, we didn't explore the landscape of Ontario. So I moved here and I really just wanted to know these places. And it had always been a dream to go to Algonquin. Of course, I loved Tom Thompson and seen a wonderful show that had a big impact at the Vancouver Art Gallery. So I picked that place as my first journey into the forests of Ontario. And it was during COVID. I'm not a big camper, and I like to follow trails. And I found a lodge there called Bartlett Lodge, which during COVID was a dream for me because I didn't have to see anyone. So they serve, it includes your meals, which they serve with a knock on the door in a little bag because the dining room wasn't open because of COVID. So that was amazing. And I set up a little mock studio in my cabin and went out during the days to hike. And I explored, I went back there maybe 3 times to hike. I don't know in relation to COVID if the work itself was influenced by that, but it was more like the opportunity to be self-indulgent, I think, which was...
And be alone in the woods.
Yeah.
But something else happened there in the way that you found you had to, in a sense, look at the woods and work from the woods, which was actually not being able to sit on that little camp stool with your materials.
Yeah, so when I took that first trip, my joints weren't working. It was ridiculous. So you had to take a boat to get there. I'd get out of the boat and fall on the deck, and the guys had to help me up, and I'd say, well, I think you got to carry my bags up. I don't know what's wrong. My joints aren't working right. But I was so determined, and I had walking sticks, so I'd walk the trails like a snail. Mm-hmm. Awesome. It was
perfect pace for looking.
Slowed me down. But I think the main thing Jessica's asking about was how I transform my working process, mostly because of that illness. But by the way, I have been diagnosed and I'm on a cure, so I'm getting better. But I had packed to take all my gear with me, which is like this backpack and the water bottles and the portfolio. So I said to myself, I'm going to go on this easy trail. So I went on the bog trail, which is basically a boardwalk and totally flat. Mm-hmm. And I went 100 feet, and I realized I can't carry all this stuff. Yeah. And then I got the canes, and so I went back to the car, and I ditched it all, and I just said, I'm just going to walk. And then I realized I had my iPhone, and you love taking those panorama pictures. I realized you could do it vertically. So as I walked the trails or whatever, and I found the tree that compelled me at the moment, I would take a vertical panorama of the tree. And I took over 500 photos and would take them back to the cabin. And that's where all of these images were born through the camera. Because, of course, the camera doesn't isolate the tree, but you go from there when you're experiencing, you remember what you experienced, and then you look at the photo.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you went up there, was climate change and environmental collapse something that you were already thinking about a lot before you made that trip, or did it kind of come home to roost in that COVID period for you?
Climate change has always been on my mind. I think in the 90s and 2000s, we weren't conscious of it. But for example, back in 2006 or something like that, I went on a trip down to Florida to go to the Everglades because I lived in Florida as a child for a while. And I remembered the Okefenokee swamp lake area. And I did a lot of reading about it. And they diverted that wetland to send water to Miami, way, way back in history. And then, so here I was in the Everglades, and everything was threatened because they hadn't done the planning to revitalize it. And out of that trip, and another trip I took to Mississippi, I got another series of paintings called Swoon, which you can see on my website. And it throughout permeated the work was the dryness and the bright, bright, bright light of what was once a rainforest. So as I have aged myself, I think one of the first books I read that really, really raised my awareness was Elizabeth Colbert's The Sixth Extinction. And that just hit me really strongly. And ever since then, I've been reading as much as I can about climate change.
Yeah, and that was one of the wonderful things that we discovered in as we were talking about the work, that at some point we'd been doing almost parallel reading. So we started to exchange, or I just found this.
Yeah.
I think you'll really like it.
Yeah.
And that was a very rich part of being able to work on this exhibition with Sandra. I don't know if you want to at this point focus on some of the reading that, it's not that the reading led to the work, but the reading reinforced some of the feelings
Yeah,
you were
I
having about what you were seeing.
I think the reading, I mean, I wanted to thank you for sharing all that reading with me, because to share books with someone is such a great pleasure, and to share all that knowledge and have little discussions about this and that. I actually brought we read many books, but I brought this because it was my most pleasurable read. And
Fantastic writer.
it's called The Tree Line, if you're interested.
It's by Ben
Ben
Rollins.
Rollins, who
Ben
happens to
Rollins.
be Welsh, as I recall. Fantastic writer.
But everything I learned when we read Finding the Mother Tree, I learned all about the earth and the community of trees. And that was actually part of the vision, that I wanted the gallery to be a community of trees speaking to each other. And then any scientific information you can get about forestry and the movement of the forests are marching northward, and how that affects the indigenous people that make their livelihood from hunting as their forests turn into shrubbery, and
And the loss of their medicinal trees, which is really important in the
yeah, I
history,
mean,
too.
all of that is just so rich. And it also, I haven't stopped reading. I think the last book I read that had a lot of impact was Greta Thunberg's The Climate Book, which is like about that thick, but I actually listened to it on audio, which I find easier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that I think when we began those conversations, I was like many people reading about all these incredible fungal networks and all the theories about the trees communicating. And this has been going on for quite a few years. And then toward the end, so this is the next frontier, I come across a book called The Arbornaut. It's a woman who is doing all her research up high in the canopy, where there's a whole other ecology of life. So actually it's threatened from both ends, put it that way. But maybe let's move to what you did with the gouaches, because as I recall it, it was very, you knew where you were going to go with them. And I recall very well, as some people in this room might, an exhibition that you did at the AGO. Again, my sense of time is warped by COVID, but it's probably about 6 years ago now.
2015 or 2017.
Oh, not bad. And that was, there you had paintings, you had images suspended, you had images on the wall, you had what for me were like gestures or fragments also
It was very immersive.
very
Yeah.
immersive, exactly. And it was only actually after you decided to do this, I thought, she was kind of already on a path of working with space, of putting us in the paintings. And I don't know if you'd like to talk about how this developed, because it went through quite a few stages to get this far.
In the beginning of looking at the gouaches and trying to envision a work out of it, I had imagined myself painting, using the gouaches as studies and doing many very large-scale paintings. But because of my illness, I don't have the energy, nor was I supposed to do physical labor. So, and then I also started thinking about a possible specific space for the work. And the thought crossed my mind to get them printed large scale. I mean, artists are working with large scale fabric prints more and more. It's more and more, let's say, available with the digital capabilities. And I think I had, at that point, I had a model, and I started hanging pieces of fabric in it that would sort of match the scale. They didn't have any images on them. But that's how the work started, the formation of what the space might look like. So the magic of the prints for me were that both that it was a solution to a physical problem, and sometimes restraints can be incredibly bright in that they lead you down a path that you wouldn't normally have taken. And the other thing that the prints did was they captured the freshness of the act of painting plein air. Because if you tried to do a large-scale painting from those, they would be a completely different animal. But here you see how the brush work was quick or
That's so
spontaneous.
So interesting you say that, because one of the points of the Tom Thompson show will be, like, there are about 5 or 6 large-scale works that retain the spontaneity and beauty of the sketches. But both Ian and I feel like it's the sketches that are the real accomplishment, where you really see him improvising in a kind of raw, unmediated way. And so that the show adjacent to yours will be about All Hail the Sketch, you know, the sort of spontaneous sketch. And I think you're right. The other wonderful thing about the fact that it's printed on banners is that we have, of course, you know, more than 40,000 young people here running around in our galleries. On our family Sundays, we sometimes have 2,000 people here, as we did for the Coronation Day. We don't have to be quite so, I mean, if those were paintings, we would have to keep people behind a rope, and they wouldn't be able to experience it as an environment. And because of this, we can let them be in there and
I think
running around. Gently.
Jessica was mentioning the exhibition at the AGO that I had in 2017 called Room for Mystics. What I realized is that once you put a painting in the middle of a space, I mean, those paintings were like only this far off the floor, and they were little teepee things. But anyway, people lose their inhibitions. They're like jumping around them and trying to like caress them from a distance or whatever. Dancing, people took incredible selfies in there, but because they were having so much fun. But it does take that wall of intimidation down. I think it tends to loosen people up and go for the joy of the experience. Yeah.
Well, I only walked in here, I guess, just over a day ago, and I knew all the plans, but the sensation I had, which was quite wonderful, was being almost embraced by the gesture. And I was so aware of your gestures. They were mainly larger than me, and I knew the original images. So So there is this exuberance that you feel in the gouaches, but that is enveloping in there, in the installation. But the same thing that I felt the first time I looked at them was happening is that the longer I stayed with them, the more I was aware of your use of color, which on one hand is very bright and happy, and then after a while you become very aware of this redness, this sky that, is it a sunset or is it a fire? And then at a certain point there's a branch on fire. And that's one of the things that really interested me in the work, especially when we began to talk more about climate change, is how you lead us somewhat, there's something ambivalent going on there, and then you have to kind of face that there's something that's not quite right.
It's dystopic
After
on
all.
some
Yeah.
level, even though it's so beautiful.
Yeah, and
Well,
then,
we've all had that experience of, like, we know that sunset is so beautiful
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
there's particulate in the business.
Yeah.
Impressionism was born of this moment of,
yeah.
you know,
And that brings us to
curiosity about that.
your title for the show, which was very much yours.
Sublime Rage. Yeah, tell us about that wonderful title.
Well, the sublime is the notion of the romantic that was popularized by painters in the 19th century. And the idea of the awe of nature was that it was there to conquer, and the painters captured the beautiful moment, and it exuded virtue, these beautiful moments. And it is so embedded, I feel, in us, in the Western world, like the beautiful red sunset, we can't help but be in awe of, where we know it's there because of all the particulate in the atmosphere, and ever, ever, ever increasing. And then I had done some reading by a anthropologist who's also a philosopher, who's also an artist, Michael Tausig. And in the book, he's very abject when it comes to his view of how artists can speak to this idea we have about nature. It's like, I don't know if you know the philosopher Georges Bataille, but it's like putting the slime and muck and ooze and worst possible scenario onto this sublime. So that's where the title Sublime Rage came from. It's as if the forest itself is raging and knows its beauty. So that's where the title comes from.
Yeah, and also what I got from that was the sense that we are, even as we watch this happening, there's always that hope that, well, we've been, basically raping nature, destroying it for so long, and yet the sublime nature can recover. Nature is stronger. Well, it's stronger in ways now that threaten us. So I also saw that kind of nature's rages.
Yeah. I mean, the other great Canadian painter of environmental concerns, of course, was Emily Carr, who we have here in our collection. And I know, those many years of teaching out in Victoria, you became very, familiar with her and her legacy and the way that she's been understood or perhaps misunderstood. Can you talk for a little bit about your relationship to Carr and her legacy? And
yeah, Emily Carr has a huge presence in Victoria, where I lived for 25 years. But it's in a way, I might say misunderstood. She's misunderstood by the tourism around the myth of her eccentricity. So in front of the Emperor's Hotel, there's a bronze statue of her with a monkey on her shoulder. And I mean, of course, they love her painting, but they just see her as this feminine kook or something. And then if you do all the amazing research, like Sarah's, I think, one of the experts on Emily Carr's painting, you realize what an amazing painter she was. And she...
And thinker, even more importantly, almost.
Her
No?
what?
And thinker,
And thinker,
you know,
yeah.
like you.
And I mean, I think when it first hit me was I was very privileged to take a sailing trip up to Haida Gwaii, and we had a special, with our little group, we had a special visit to the site that she did a painting of with all the
House posts.
the posts.
Yeah,
And
exactly. We have one right back there.
They had, the people have now, with complete pride, they took us on a tour and they said, you can't walk there, and we're not preserving. The historians want to come and load them up with resin holes everywhere, but we just want to see them live their life. And so they're now guardians of these poles. And it was just such a powerful experience. And it made me remember that she did visit these places, and she wasn't like the touristic painter. She knew what was going on. So, yeah.
She saw her moment really clearly. I mean, she made numerous paintings about clear cutting, for example, and she referred to stumps as screamers and sometimes figured them with little tiny crimson, seepages coming out of the stump to indicate the life force that a fellow living being, like she experienced trees like that, like in fellowship, not as she was a human and the tree was on some other plane. And I feel like that's something that you really can feel in your work, and that you've achieved that in these paintings and in your thinking about trees in the forest. There's a way in which Carr was able to be humble as a human being, that we, as a rogue species, we're not doing such a good job at that, like she was 100 years ahead of her time.
Yeah, there was a few phrases, I'm sorry I didn't bring them from your diary, that you shared with me, or notes that you made, I think, before you actually went on one of the trips, where the tenor of what you were saying was, I'm there to observe. I'm there to look. I'm going to be open and
Receptive.
warm and
Yeah,
appreciative of what's there.
Yeah.
And to me, it was such a wonderful way of saying, wait a minute, what do we do about this? But it's not necessarily action right away. It's respectful looking and thinking about our position. That's what I got out of what you said.
Oh, being present to it. Because I think it's just so
present to it.
easy to read the headlines and understand, and then to somehow, the human brain is not engineered to contemplate its own extinction. Like, this is something we know, right? It's something that's like pushing two ends of a magnet the wrong way around towards each other. The brain will just keep going like this, and not really engaging with it. And so, what I think is so amazing about what you achieved there and what you're making possible for us is to stay in that moment of thinking. And that was the whole idea also behind Uses of Enchantment downstairs, was to create a space. These artists are creating spaces in which we can stay in the thought, because they are using all of their arts of enchantment, as you have here, to draw people in and hold them in a way that makes them feel okay to think about it. And that kind of thinking has to happen.
I think the important thing is in what you both are saying, and you started off by talking about the color in the work, and this is what anyone can do, is when I was doing the gouaches, so in the display case, you'll see the originals, there was really no thought involved whatsoever. It was just feeling how the air was, what the temperature was, feeling tree itself. I mean, I know that I was working from a photograph, but I had remembered the experience of that walk. So it was just the focus of the moment, the colors on my palette kind of going, and it was just it's just so exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they
to
have that
time.
spontaneity. That's
Yeah.
what's exciting about looking at them.
But I think, I think like Carr, I mean, there is this quality of really identifying with the tree. And I wonder if you'd share with us the story about one of the gouaches is of what we call a nurse log, a great big, huge fallen down tree that has saplings rising out of it. And you had a kind of really compelling encounter with this.
Yeah.
With this.
Yeah. So there's one trail in Algonquin that you come upon it looks like a pig pen. It's just really like basically this very large crate, and you can't hardly see over top of it. And you kind of see it in the distance on the trail, and well, my God, what's that doing there? And then you look in, and it's a mother log that's being protected, because obviously people walk by it and they did all sorts of terrible things to it.
Climbed on it or kicked the thing. Yeah.
I don't know. So, and there it was in all its beautiful delicacy with little trees growing out of it. And it was very amazing to encounter that.
But it sounds
And you're reminding me actually of something you sent to me very recently about protecting or not protecting trees in Algonquin. And I know you want to talk about that.
I did want to just state for the record here that Algonquin is a huge provincial protected parkland that was founded in the 1890s. But it has always also been an industrial area for forestry. And some people don't know that 65% of Algonquin Park is logged. So, and there
second
are
growth. Yeah, it's
And
second
it's
growth or
still
third
open
growth.
for logging.
Yeah.
there are 6,000 kilometers of logging roads in Algonquin Park, and these roads impede creatures to thrive. They need to traverse the land, and they can't. So although the forestry industry says they do selective logging and it's all very controlled, it's one of only a few so-called protected lands that still allow industry to operate within it. And there's a call out now by the Wilderness Committee of Canada to get people to try to actively pursue their elected officials to do something
Shut this
about
down.
that.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. Like we have an essay in the Tom Thompson catalog written by a woman called Christine McCrae Lakasavich. And she is the ultimate Canadian family, as you can tell from her name. Her father came from Polish logging stock, and her mother is Algonquin, from the region of Algonquin Park. And her grandfather was, I guess, great-grandfather, was the indigenous person of the Algonquin people who tried to agitate for there to be a designated reserve of land in what is currently Algonquin Park for the indigenous people of that region. And ultimately he was unsuccessful. They now live in Whitney, the family, and they have for a few generations now. But, she pointed out to me, and it's in this essay that we're about to publish, that, when you declared it a park, like all the land claims that were held by settler people were honored. So there's many people who have cabins in Algonquin Park. They're white people. The only people that were actually excluded when it was made a park were the indigenous people.
Yeah.
But all the logging claims continued, all the land held by white people continued. So the creation of parks is actually something we really need to understand in Canada, because it's often really simply about one thing, which is excluding indigenous people off their traditional lands. And anyway, it's this backstory to Algonquin Park. I've gotten kind of obsessed with the history of it, but you know,
I
you're
think
bringing
it's
all this
really
forward.
important to be aware of all these things, along with this push to declare it logging free. There's also a push to allow Indigenous people to have stewardship of the park, the
To
whole
have hunting
park.
rights, yeah.
Yeah.
It's an amazing place.
Should we come back to the creatures just for a minute?
The
Because-
creatures, sure.
The
what are-
creatures, because
The creatures.
I know that the work now is going more toward birds, and there are a few, there's your raven guide, so maybe we
Yeah.
can talk about the raven guide.
Yeah, tell us about
in
the
this
raven.
work. Tell us about.
Okay, there are 3 giant birds in the exhibition, a raven, a hooded warbler, and a ruby-throated hummingbird. When I went on one of my hikes at the trailhead, a raven approached me and literally spoke to me. And I was taken aback. I mean, I was actually kind of scared. It was very powerful. And
Was it on the ground in front of you?
it was on the ground in front of me.
Did it come
And it-
from a distance, or was it right there?
It just kind of seemed to swoop in and then be there.
It was watching you
It was like
already.
magic. And it actually followed me for quite a ways. And I thought about that quite a bit afterwards. And I actually talked to my therapist about it. And she said, well, you should look it up and find out what who it
Signifying.
is. And I did. And I have this book of spirit cards for animals, and the raven is taking you into darkness and telling you to explore that darkness. So what a message to receive. And I knew the raven had to be there, but I didn't really want the raven to be alone, so I did.
Got it, some company.
Some lighter
I've
company.
been also, I'm working on another exhibition that opens on Thursday.
Yeah, I
that-
circulated that. I handed everyone the invitation
They're
to that
all
show. Yeah.
birds, but they are all dead birds. So many of them are taxidermy, paintings of taxidermy cabinets, and then some of them are paintings of sublime landscapes, and all the figures in the landscapes are replaced with birds lying, dead birds. But one of the trips I took to Algonquin, I went on a guided tour with an ornithologist who had studied at Cornell, and we spent more than 3 hours together in not too great a area of the forest. He pointed out to me, I mean, I made a list of them somewhere, of all the species that we encountered. I mean, he lent me his giant binoculars and all that so I could actually see them, but I just learned so much. I never knew that it happened to be the warbler season for when they were first appearing. I think it was in May. And he told me that each species of warbler has its own strata of the tree where it gets its food from, each for different things.
So that's the canopy life that has all kinds of other
Yeah.
species that don't even go below that level. As
Yeah, I
learned.
mean, these weren't like really, really high trees, but that is the idea. But it just kind of woke me up to the specificity of each species and what its value was and how they survive together and like they store food and they remember where it is and all of these amazing things. So that's why they're the birds. I did contemplate putting
Bugs.
some insects in there and
For the birds to eat.
crawly things, but
They would get really
it
big.
didn't really
in the
work.
process.
Could have been scary.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we should see if anyone has questions in the audience, because this has been
That's a
great,
good-
but maybe there's some.
That's a good time.
Very
time
soon.
for that.
Sandra, I really enjoyed your recent book that came out with ECW Press, and I
Thank you.
appreciated having the opportunity to read and reflect a little more in a more concentrated way about all of your work to date. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the publication process for this book was like for you.
Oh, the
And was it
book.
your idea, or did someone approach you with the idea to do the book, and how that came about?
Paul. And it's so nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too.
Thanks for mentioning the book. I was going to do some plugging on it
Yes.
later, but so just for those of you who don't know it, the book covers 40 years of selected works throughout my career, divided into 4 chapters of themes that I've addressed. And let's see, the Gothic, the slapstick humor, nature, narrative and nature, or nature through narrative, I can't remember, and then transformation, which happened to me when my husband passed away about 10 years ago. So where I got the idea for the book was that I think my work has never been addressed as a whole. And from my perspective anyway, I don't know if this is true, but people tend to see it as very eclectic. She does this, she does that, and how the hell do we put this all together, and who is this person, and whatever. But so actually, I had a conversation with my daughter, Evelyn, who's here, and because I think I had applied for a grant to do a book, I was writing a statement of how to get money to do a book, and I said, "Oh, I'm just wringing my head, I don't know." And she said, "Well, what do you want people to know? Like, what is it you want them to know?"
Why is this so complicated? Yeah. Just say it.
So that was it, the four things. And I think putting that down is what led the publisher to accept the idea of publishing it. Plus, we found a great writer, Helen Marzoff, and a great designer, Clint Hutzelack. So, and then I also wrote 4 little short stories about my childhood that are smack in the middle of it. But it has been a joy to me to have seen the book come out.
And we'll be making a beautiful little publication on this specific new work that she's made that will come out probably in about 3-4 weeks from now. So that'll be another thing on the shelf.
Yeah, and there'll be, I mean, usually you have them, try and have them for the opening, but
Yeah.
we really want to get a sense of the installation. So
Yeah,
there'll
we
be
needed to wait to
installation
shoot
shots in it.
this finished yesterday, so we had the photographer in here last night. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts? Yes.
I'm curious, with the gouache, have you done watercolor or acrylic when you've done plein air, and why are you choosing gouache over those other 2 mediums?
Watercolor to me it requires a lot of skill, and I never learned that skill. So if I had, I might do watercolor. But acrylic, I did try to do some with acrylic. I tried to do some with oil, and I tried to make my little Tom Thompson kit where you could carry back the wet oils with you, blah, blah, blah. But
Yeah.
I ended up having to put them in the bathroom where I was staying with the heat turned up to like 150. And I mean, it was ridiculous. So no, I don't do that anymore. So what I really like about the gouache is how direct it is, and it's opaque. So the color you see is the color you get. Also, it dries immediately, and then you can just pack it up and get going. Do I layer the gouache? Not often, no. I don't. I don't find it layers well. That's the beauty of watercolor.
But you pull off that effect.
You can see through the layers
Yeah.
in watercolor, but not with gouache.
But there's a beautiful sort of knitting together, though, of what feels like layers. I can think about the raven gouache, the beautiful feathers with the black and blue kind of,
Yeah, I don't know how I did that.
I don't know how you did that. It's another mystery about Sandra Meigs. Yeah.
I have a quick question about finding the right printing process.
Okay.
How beautifully.
Yeah.
How
Vivid they are.
Thank you so
we
much.
feel brushstrokes
On that
and-
note, I wanted to mention Dimitri at the Image Foundry, who was my digital tech. So, I mean, I know nothing about digital technology, but to get the quality of the prints, for one thing, required the expert eye of someone who knows what happens with color and how each calibration has to be so spot on. I did go to a local fabric printer that does commercial things for, things you see at trade shows and I did have some samples made from them. I experimented with different fabrics. I thought it might work with kind of transparent fabric. So I did do a lot of research into printing. The commercial company here, I think it's in Newmarket, it didn't work for me because it was not good enough quality looking. Like the hemming was rough and all that stuff. Like, who cares when you're in a trade fair or something like that? But I mean, don't mean to put it down, but and for some artists, that method would work because that's what they're after. They're sort of a critique of
Commercial signage and stuff.
the commercial world. But so I had used a company before for the AGO show called Rosebrand, which is a theatrical fabricator, and they also sell things for the theater, and they can print at 20 feet wide and however long you need.
So
And
they would make like backdrops for the opera, and
yeah,
that kind of thing.
They're big
Yeah.
big stuff. And it was through actually the encouragement of Sarah to go the distance. And that's how I got to that stage. But there was a lot of back and forth with the digital technologist in terms of getting the color right, a lot of testing and all of that sort of thing. What fabric for the printing? So I did experiment with lots of fabrics. It's a polyester mock canvas. It's hard to get a fabric that'll do matte. A lot of them are shiny. So I did a lot of fabric experimenting and that sort of thing. But that's available through that printer, Rosebrand.
It also means that you can clean it, which is great. Might be useful. You don't know how those children are going to behave themselves. So, yes.
I just wanted to comment on, as I listened to you talk about how you talked about the books together, how you talk about publishing and printing and whatever. What a wonderful collaboration amongst women
Yes.
that I'm hearing. Not a question, but a
Absolutely.
comment.
I'll applaud that.
Felt that way.
So thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you, Jessica and Sarah. A wonderful talk.
Thank you.